The warm glow of the evening lights bathed La Fontaine, an upscale restaurant in Raleigh, North Carolina. The soft murmur of conversations blended with the gentle clinking of fine china and the smooth jazz drifting from a corner piano. Every detail of the atmosphere spoke of luxury and exclusivity. Deborah, a 25-year-old waitress, moved with quiet efficiency between tables. Her uniform blended her into the background, but behind her composed exterior was a mind filled with music. The grand piano had always been her escape, a place where emotions turned into melodies. But life was unforgiving, and for now, her reality was balancing trays instead of composing symphonies. She dreamed of attending a prestigious music academy, but until then, La Fontaine was her stepping stone. The evening was settling when the restaurant doors swung open. Leonard Grayson strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. A wealthy entrepreneur with an air of entitlement, he was known for his sharp wit and love for making an entrance. Accompanied by an entourage of equally polished guests, he carried himself as if he owned not just the room, but the people in it. Deborah noticed the subtle tension among her co-workers. Leonard had a reputation, one that made even experienced staff tread carefully. He thrived on spectacle and was notorious for pushing people to their limits. To Deborah, however, he was just another demanding customer in a long night. As she moved between tables, Leonard's gaze locked onto her. A flicker of curiosity crossed his face, followed by a smirk. She felt the weight of his attention but chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the rhythmic flow of her tasks. Yet Leonard was not one to be ignored. This night was about to take an unexpected turn. Deborah had spent her childhood in a small town in South Carolina, where dreams often felt as unreachable as the stars. Raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse, she grew up understanding sacrifice. Their home was modest, but it was filled with music. Her mother's old vinyl records and an out-of-tune piano gifted by a neighbor became Deborah's greatest treasures. While other children played outside, she spent hours at the keys, mimicking songs from the radio and learning classical melodies from second-hand books. Her talent quickly became apparent. She played at church, school recitals, and community events, drawing admiration from those who heard her. But admiration did not erase financial hardships. By 18, it became clear that a professional music career would have to wait. Scholarship opportunities fell through, and family responsibilities took priority. With a heavy heart, Deborah set aside her concert dreams, choosing practicality over passion. Moving to Raleigh offered a fresh start, but music remained in the background. She took a job at La Fontaine, not just for the paycheck, but because of the grand piano sitting elegantly in the restaurant's corner. Even if she rarely had time to touch the keys, just knowing it was there brought comfort. Music had not abandoned her, it was simply waiting. That evening, as Leonard and his entourage settled into their seats, Deborah approached with practiced grace, balancing a tray with effortless precision. The wealthy entrepreneur ordered a top-shelf scotch, making a remark loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Deborah responded with a polite smile, keeping her composure despite the subtle tension in the air. Leonard studied her name tag, his lips curling into an amused smirk. "Deborah," he mused, as if testing the sound of it. "Sounds like someone with hidden talents." His words caught her off guard, but she simply nodded, placing their orders before stepping away. She didn't notice the knowing glances he exchanged with his companions or the way his eyes followed her movements. Tonight, she was his chosen entertainment. He had already decided that much. The evening continued with its usual rhythm, clinking glasses, soft laughter, and the shuffle of silverware against porcelain. Deborah moved swiftly between tables, keeping her focus sharp, deliberately avoiding Leonard's gaze. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but there was something unsettling about him. His arrogance wasn't just typical wealth-induced entitlement, it was deliberate, calculated. By the time appetizers were served, Leonard had taken center stage at his table. He spoke loudly, regaling his entourage with exaggerated tales of his success while slipping in condescending remarks about those who lacked ambition. His companions laughed in practiced agreement, while nearby diners exchanged irritated glances. Deborah did her best to tune him out, keeping her movements precise and professional. But as she returned to his table with a bottle of wine, Leonard's voice cut through the noise, stopping her mid-step. "So, Deborah," he mused, his tone carrying an edge of amusement. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely a young woman like you has dreams." She hesitated, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. Carefully she offered a simple answer. "I play piano sometimes," she said softly, hoping to leave it at that. Leonard's expression shifted, his eyes gleaming with intrigue. A slow smile spread across his face. "A pianist, huh? How fascinating." His voice carried through the restaurant as he leaned back in his chair. "Why don't you give us a little performance?" The request caught her off guard. She stiffened, her fingers tightening around the wine bottle. A nervous laugh escaped her lips. "Oh, I couldn't," she said quickly. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Leonard wasn't interested in her refusal. With a wave of his hand, he dismissed her protest. "Nonsense," he declared, his voice booming across the room. "There's a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Surely a future star like you isn't afraid of a little audience." His companions chuckled, entertained by the spectacle. Other diners turned their heads, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. Deborah's chest tightened. The restaurant, once a background hum of movement, now felt suffocatingly still. Every set of eyes in the room was on her, waiting for her to react. The weight of silent judgment filled the room, pressing down on Deborah as if waiting for her to crack. She wanted to refuse, to walk away, but Leonard's challenge lingered, daring her to rise to it or crumble beneath its weight. "I really shouldn't," she stammered, searching for support among her colleagues, but they hesitated, unsure of how to intervene. Leonard leaned back, sipping his scotch with a smirk. "Ah, I see," he said mockingly. "All talk, no talent, that's disappointing." The words stung. Deborah clenched her fists, swallowing the heat rising in her chest. She had never been one for confrontation, but something about his dismissive tone, treating her as if she were insignificant, cut deeper than she expected. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Never let anyone make you small, Deborah. You're bigger than they'll ever know." A heavy silence stretched between them. Deborah's gaze flickered to the grand piano, its polished surface gleaming under the dim restaurant lights. Then she looked back at Leonard, his expression smug, his challenge still hanging in the air. "Fine. I'll play," she said, her voice steady but low. The room bristled with anticipation as Deborah walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last, burdened with both fear and defiance. The soft glow of the chandelier cast a quiet spotlight on her, isolating her from the murmuring crowd. Sliding onto the bench, she hesitated for just a second. The keys gleamed beneath her fingertips, a familiar comfort in an unfamiliar battle. Behind her, Leonard lounged in satisfaction, convinced he had already won whatever cruel game he was playing. Deborah closed her eyes, taking a slow, steady breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm almost drowning out the world around her. This was nothing like the church recitals or community gatherings of her past. This was different. This was hostile, but there was no turning back. Her fingers found the keys, pressing down lightly. The first notes were soft, hesitant, almost uncertain, The first notes were fragile, tentative. A few diners shifted in their seats and someone coughed in the back of the room. Deborah ignored them. She focused, leaning into the music, letting it pull her in. She chose a piece she knew by heart, a soulful rendition of Clair de Lune by Debussy. The melody spilled into the room, weaving through the air like a delicate but unyielding thread. As her confidence grew, so did the music. Her hands moved with a grace that betrayed the storm inside her, each note carrying a piece of her story. The sacrifices her mother made, the nights spent practicing in a cramped room, the weight of all dreams deferred, but never abandoned. The restaurant fell silent. The usual hum of conversation faded into nothing. Even Leonard, who had been whispering to his companions moments ago, was quiet. Deborah didn't need to look at him to feel the shift in the atmosphere. The mocking energy had evaporated, replaced by something she couldn't quite name. Awe, humility. The music soared, and for the first time in years, Deborah let herself go. In that moment, she wasn't a waitress. She wasn't just a struggling dreamer. She was simply herself, an artist. Her fingers danced across the keys, pouring out emotions, so raw and vivid they seemed to linger in the air like smoke. Then, the final chord. The resonance of the piano hung in the stillness. No one moved, no one spoke. Deborah sat frozen, her hands resting lightly on the keys, bracing for whatever would come next. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the room erupted into applause. It was thunderous, reverberating off the walls. Some diners stood, clapping with a fervor that sent a lump to her throat. Her co-workers joined in, their faces glowing with pride. Leonard, however, remained seated. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something unreadable, shock, discomfort, maybe even regret. He raised his hands and clapped slowly, the hollow sound drowned out by the cheers around him. Whatever he had intended that night, it had backfired spectacularly. Deborah had reclaimed her voice, and no amount of condescension could take that away. As the applause began to fade, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Deborah slowly stood, her knees still trembling. Deborah stood, her back straight, her breath steady. As she glanced around, she no longer saw the diners as mere spectators, but as witnesses. Their expressions carried something different now. Admiration, respect, even awe. She acknowledged them with a small nod, her lips curving into a faint smile. It wasn't pride she felt, but relief. Relief that she hadn't let fear silence her. Then, inevitably, her gaze found Leonard. He remained seated, his hands clasped in front of him on the table. The confidence he had worn so effortlessly before was gone, replaced by a mask of forced neutrality. He looked as though he couldn't decide whether to acknowledge his mistake or cling to his arrogance. "Well," Leonard finally said, his voice louder than necessary, breaking the fragile silence. "That was unexpected." He chuckled, but the usual bravado was missing. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places." His words landed flat. His companions exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Deborah studied him, unshaken. His comment was meant as an olive branch, but it was hollow, weighed down by his unwillingness to truly own the moment. "Thank you," she said, her tone calm, deliberate. There was no warmth, no hostility, just certainty. She wasn't about to let him shrink her back into the smallness he had tried to impose. Her performance had spoken louder than any rebuttal ever could. Leonard cleared his throat, shifting in his seat as the weight of the room's collective gaze settled on him. He gestured for another drink, a flimsy attempt to regain his composure. "You've got quite a gift," he admitted almost begrudgingly. Deborah nodded, but her gaze had already moved past him. She had nothing left to prove. Unwavering, Deborah met Leonard's gaze. "Everyone has a gift," she said, the weight of her words deliberate. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The room seemed to hold its breath again. Her response wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, but it was enough. A quiet truth that rippled through the air, undeniable. Leonard shifted in his seat, his usual air of dominance slipping further. The effortless charm, the unchecked arrogance, it was all unraveling under the weight of what had just happened. The diners, sensing the shift, slowly returned to their meals, but the energy in the room had changed. Where there had once been the hum of privilege and pretense, there was now something deeper. A shared understanding. A quiet respect for the waitress who had reminded them all of the power of authenticity. Leonard wasn't just embarrassed, he was exposed. No amount of charm or deflection could shield him from the truth anymore. Everyone had seen him, truly seen him, in a way he wasn't used to. Deborah stepped away from the piano, her heart still pounding, but her shoulders lighter. Her colleagues greeted her with quiet smiles and subtle nods of encouragement. She still had a job to do, but something had shifted within her. She stood a little taller, moved with more intention. Leonard's table had fallen into silence. His entourage, who had laughed so freely at her expense, now avoided eye contact. Their conversation was subdued, the bravado that had filled their corner of the restaurant now completely drained away. The night continued, but Deborah felt different. As she moved through the dining room, she was no longer just a waitress. She was something more. Patrons stopped her to offer quiet words of admiration. "You're incredible," an older woman whispered as Deborah set down a coffee cup. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so beautiful." "Keep going," another man encouraged. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Deborah nodded, gratitude swelling in her chest. These weren't just empty compliments. They were affirmations, proof that everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of, was real. Leonard, however, was less gracious. When Deborah returned with the check, he looked up at her with an expression caught between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said, his tone clipped. "No need to rub it in." She met his gaze, unwavering. "It was never about proving anything to you," she said, calm but firm. "I just wanted to play." Leonard had no response. He fidgeted with his glass, his once commanding presence reduced to an awkward shuffle. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone at the table knew it. As he scribbled his signature on the receipt, one of his companions, a younger man with a softer demeanor, looked at Deborah and said, "You were amazing, truly." The sincerity in his voice surprised her. For a moment, she saw a flicker of humanity in a group she had dismissed as shallow. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small smile before walking away. By the time the night ended, Leonard and his group left quietly. No grand exit, no final words, just a hasty retreat. Deborah watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. Leonard was no longer on her mind. She was already thinking ahead. The tips that night were unusually generous, enough to cover her rent and leave extra for piano lessons she had been postponing. As she locked up and stepped into the crisp night air, she felt something she hadn't in years: certainty. She wasn't just a waitress, and she wasn't just a dreamer. Not even fear could take that away from her. As Deborah walked home, her thoughts weren't on the conflict of the night, but on the future. For the first time, her dreams felt within reach. Sitting on the worn bench in her small apartment, she let her fingers glide over the keys of her old upright piano. The sound lacked the richness of the grand piano at La Fontaine, but it didn't matter. The music still came from her heart, just as it always had. Something had shifted, not just a fleeting triumph, but a realization. Her talent wasn't something she needed to hide or justify. It was hers, and it was enough. In the days that followed, her performance became a local story. Patrons who had witnessed the moment shared it, and word spread. Then an unexpected call came. A music producer from Nashville who had been dining that night reached out. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but a chance to record a demo, a step toward something she had only dared to dream of. Deborah agreed. Not because she believed it would change her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening. One she was finally ready to walk through. For years, doubt had whispered lies, telling her she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too big. But now, she saw the truth. Resilience and authenticity were her greatest strengths. The incident with Leonard Grayson had been more than a public humiliation turned victory. It was a reminder of the power of integrity. Leonard, with all his wealth and bravado, had nothing that could diminish her. He was just another voice of doubt, like so many she had battled before. And she had silenced him with nothing but the purity of her craft. To anyone watching her story, her message was clear. Never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of Leonard Graysons, people who project their insecurities onto others to feel powerful. But true power comes from knowing who you are and letting your passion speak louder than their ridicule. Closing the piano lid, Deborah rested her hands on the faded wood and smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time it felt like it had truly begun. What about you? What dream have you been holding back because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Leonard to test you. Take your step forward. Now, if Deborah's story inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Your story could be next.